0300 hours. Caracas. The explosion that breached the detention facility's outer wall was not a bomb in the conventional sense. It was a message, 250 pounds of thermobaric pressure, precisely directed, precisely timed, sending molten steel through a gate that Venezuelan intelligence had believed was permanent. Inside, 5 Americans sat shackled in a regime's worst miscalculation. The guards had spent 48 hours convinced they held leverage. They had no idea the USS Gerald R. Ford's targeting architecture had already cataloged every structural feature of the building they were standing in, from the thermal signature of the generator room to the footprint of the satellite relay dish on the roof. Washington's position had been stated once internally, with no press conference and no diplomatic cable. Detain American citizens and your command infrastructure becomes the target list. Caracas did not listen, so the lights went out. The Caribbean has not seen this volume of concentrated American naval firepower since the confrontations of the Cold War era. Operation Southern Spears, a sustained maritime interdiction campaign targeting the narcotics and illicit gold transfer networks that keep the Maduro government financially viable, had already repositioned the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group to a position of deliberate strategic dominance across Venezuela's northern maritime approaches. For months, those smuggling routes had been methodically strangled. The regime watched its revenue arteries compressed one by one and said nothing publicly while privately accelerating its backroom negotiations with whatever regional intermediaries it believed Washington couldn't track. Then the Sabine, Venezuela's Bolivarian intelligence service, detained 5 Americans. 3 dual nationals, 2 civilians with no prior connection to the regime or its operations. The calculation in Caracas was that human leverage would force an operational pause. That Washington, distracted by European and Indo-Pacific commitments, would trade compliance for the return of its citizens. It was the most expensive strategic miscalculation Nicolas Maduro's government had ever made. For 48 hours, State Department channels remained open. Offers were transmitted. Deadlines were implied rather than stated. While that process ran its course in conference rooms, Carrier Air Wing 8 was conducting its own parallel process aboard the Ford, loading ordnance, filing flight plans, and receiving target packages that had been refined by satellite imagery, updated every 6 hours. The diplomats were not being ignored. They were being given the time they needed to fail because what came next required documented exhaustion of alternatives. Veterans watching this will recognize the particular quality of silence that falls over a carrier when the ship transitions from routine operations to something else entirely. The ambient rhythm of the vessel changes, the pace changes, the expressions change. Every sailor aboard a carrier that has shifted into combat readiness posture understands without being told what has been decided. If you've heard the ship's systems come to life in that specific sequence and know exactly what it signifies, drop a 1 in the comments. You understand what the crew of the Ford was feeling in those hours before dawn. To understand why the regime in Caracas was about to experience a catastrophic system failure, you have to understand the hardware disparity at play. And it is not a gap in the conventional sense. It is a generational rupture. The USS Gerald R. Ford is the lead vessel of the most advanced carrier class ever constructed. 100,000 tons, $13 billion in acquisition cost, 23 distinct technological improvements over the Nimitz-class design that preceded her. The Electromagnetic Aircraft Launch System, EMALS, is not simply a replacement for steam catapults. It is a computer-controlled magnetic acceleration system that allows the Ford to place a fully combat-loaded FA-18F Super Hornet or F-35C Lightning II on a combat trajectory every 45 seconds with a level of airframe stress management that steam technology could never achieve. More aircraft, more ordnance, more sustained tempo. The Ford doesn't just carry more capability, she generates it faster and sustains it longer. Flanking the Ford in the strike group's formation were Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, including the USS Gravely and USS Stockdale, each carrying over 90 vertical launch system cells loaded with RGM-109E Tomahawk Block 5 land attack cruise missiles. The Tomahawk Block 5 is not the weapon your grandfather read about in the newspapers. It carries a 1,000-pound warhead, cruises at 500 miles per hour, navigates via GPS with terrain-matching backup guidance, and can be retargeted in flight by satellite uplink after launch. It can fly a sea-skimming profile at 50 feet above the water surface to avoid coastal radar coverage and arrive at a specific structural coordinate. Not a building, a specific room within a building, with a circular error probable measured in single digits of feet. The Venezuelan S-300 VM Ante 2,500 surface-to-air missile batteries that Maduro's generals pointed to as their strategic insurance were Soviet-era architecture maintained by a military whose Russian technical support contracts had been quietly allowed to lapse as Venezuela's oil revenue collapsed. On paper, the S-300VM is a capable system. In the real world of 2024 Venezuelan military maintenance budgets and technician retention rates, those batteries were operating at a readiness level their commanders would not have publicly disclosed. More critically, the AN/SPY-6 radar aboard the Ford's escorting destroyers can detect airborne targets the size of a bird at ranges that render the S-300's engagement envelope a secondary concern. The American strike group did not need to defeat the Venezuelan air defense network. It needed to make the network irrelevant, which is a different problem and a far easier one to solve. Layered above the entire operational picture was the AN/APG-79 active electronically scanned array radar aboard each Super Hornet, and more critically, the EA-18G Growler, the electronic warfare variant of the Super Hornet that carries no bombs and requires no missiles to be the most dangerous aircraft in the sky. The Growler's AN/ALQ-99 and next-generation jamming system does not simply block radar signals. It deceives. It manufactures. It flooded the Venezuelan integrated air defense network with synthetic contacts, false aircraft returns generated at specific coordinates to force radar operators into processing a picture that bore no relationship to actual airspace. Reports from Venezuelan Air Force communications intercepts indicated that at least one Su-30MK-2 pilot executed a precautionary ejection before a single U.S. weapon was released, after his radar warning receiver registered simultaneous fire control locks from 4 separate bearing lines. None of those locks were real. The Growler had written them into his threat display from a position he never located. The kinetic phase of the operation launched at exactly 0300 local time and lasted 120 seconds from first weapon impact to last. The target set was specific and deliberate. Not air defense batteries, not military bases, not personnel. The Sabine's communications backbone, the microwave relay towers and hardened fiber optic routing hubs that connected their detention network to the Central Intelligence Command Structure in Caracas. Without that infrastructure, the intelligence service could not coordinate the movement of detainees, could not transmit orders to their field units, could not reach their coastal military liaisons. The network that gave the Maduro government the ability to use those 5 Americans as controllable assets, to move them, threaten them, leverage them, was the target. Remove the network and the hostages ceased to be a tool. Tomahawks arrived at 3 relay nodes simultaneously, FA-18F. Super Hornets flying nap-of-the-earth approaches below the radar coverage horizon of the Venezuelan Early Warning Network delivered AGM-154C joint standoff weapons against 2 hardened communications facilities. The entire strike package was coordinated through Link 16, the encrypted NATO standard tactical data network, so that every aircraft and every ship in the strike group was operating from a single fused targeting picture with millisecond-level synchronization. In 120 seconds, the Sabine's command and control architecture ceased to exist. The great silence that fell across Caracas's military district was not the silence of a pause or a ceasefire. It was the silence of system failure. Screens going dark, phones going dead, officers in hardened bunkers discovering that the network they had been trained to operate through was simply gone. The coastal battery commanders could not reach Caracas. The intelligence service field units could not reach their supervisors. The Venezuelan military's left hand had been severed from its right hand in 2 minutes of precision ordnance delivery, and not a single U.S. aircraft had been engaged. Not a single U.S. pilot had been threatened by anything that registered as a credible weapons system. No American boot touched Venezuelan soil. Within 3 hours of the strike, the 5 detainees were transferred from the Sabine Black site to a civilian hospital in Caracas. The official Venezuelan government statement described the transfer as a humanitarian gesture, a medical precaution motivated by concern for the detainees' well-being. The generals who authorized that transfer knew the actual motivation. They had been demonstrated to, in the most unambiguous technical language available, that those 5 individuals were no longer leverage. They were liability. The regime's ability to move them, isolate them, or use their location as a bargaining position had been destroyed along with the communications network that made any of those options possible. The cost accounting that followed was the kind of number that stays with military planners. Venezuela lost communications infrastructure representing hundreds of millions of dollars in Russian-supplied and domestically built investment, systems described publicly by the Maduro government as irreplaceable strategic assets, presented to the Venezuelan public as the technological foundation of national defense. They were not damaged. They were not temporarily disabled pending repair. They were structurally eliminated, leaving frameworks of twisted steel that would require complete reconstruction from foundation level. The replacement timeline, given Venezuela's current foreign exchange position and the increasing reluctance of Russian defense contractors to extend credit to Caracas, runs to years, not months. But the physical destruction was not the primary cost. The primary cost was the demonstration itself, the proof, delivered in real time with real hardware against real targets, that the air defense umbrella Venezuela had spent 2 decades and enormous treasure constructing provided no protection against a carrier strike group operating with 21st century sensor fusion and precision strike capability. Every adversary with intelligence assets capable of monitoring the operation, and there are several, updated their threat assessments of the Ford-class carrier and its integrated strike capability the morning after those towers fell. The S-300 VM batteries that the Venezuelan military had pointed toward the sea as their deterrent posture were never engaged. They were bypassed, ignored, made irrelevant by a strike profile that the radar systems were architecturally incapable of tracking, and a jamming environment that made their operators' situational awareness functionally worthless before the first Tomahawk crossed the coastline. This is the lesson that echoes beyond Caracas, beyond this specific confrontation and this specific regime. The 21st century has produced a form of military power that does not respect the traditional deterrence calculus built on visible mass. Ground forces, coastal batteries, mobilized armor columns, these systems were designed to impose costs on an adversary willing to engage in symmetrical confrontation. They offer no meaningful resistance to an integrated multi-domain kill chain that can identify, track, and destroy specific targets from beyond visual range, beyond radar range, and beyond the conceptual horizon of the military doctrine those systems were built to counter. Geography is no longer a shield. Distance is no longer a buffer. And as Caracas discovered at 0300 on a Caribbean morning, a hostage is not leverage against a navy that can dismantle your ability to use one without ever needing to retrieve them by force. The Ford class exists precisely for this. The investment in emails, in the F-35C integration, in the Growler's next-generation jamming systems, in the Tomahawk Block V's in-flight retargeting capability, every dollar of that expenditure is justified by the operational outcome demonstrated here. A 5-hour campaign that neutralized a strategic provocation, protected American lives, and dismantled a hostile government's command infrastructure without a single U.S. casualty and without placing a single American service member in direct physical danger. To the veterans watching this, the discipline and professional standards you carried through your service became the foundation that made this possible. The pilots who flew those profiles, the fire control officers who managed the targeting geometry, the electronic warfare crews who constructed a false sky for Venezuelan radar operators to chase. They are the living product of an institutional commitment to excellence that your generation built and maintained. The Caribbean is quiet again this morning, but the echoes of those engine trails are being studied in defense ministries far beyond Caracas. And the conclusion they are reaching is the same one Venezuela just learned at considerable expense. When you take an American, you don't buy yourself time. You buy yourself a target list. The broader strategic question this operation forces into the open is one Washington cannot indefinitely defer. Is a persistent forward presence like Operation Southern Spear an adequate long-term framework for regional stability, or does its effectiveness depend on a willingness to use it that must be periodically demonstrated to remain credible? Some analysts argue that the demonstration itself, the proof of capability and political will delivered in those 120 seconds, resets the deterrence clock and buys years of compliance. Others contend that a regime with nothing left to lose and no path to economic recovery will eventually reach for whatever leverage it can find regardless of the demonstrated cost, and that the only durable solution is structural change in Caracas, not tactical punishment from the sea. What do you think? Has the U.S. drawn a line that holds, or is this a cycle that requires a more permanent answer? Leave your assessment in the comments. This community's perspective, especially from those who have operated in these environments, is what sharpens the analysis. And if you want a deep technical breakdown of exactly how the EA-18G Growler constructs a false targeting environment to neutralize an S-300 battery's engagement capability, let us know below.